The city lights gleamed far beyond the windows of my office. But all I could see were lifeless lines of code on the screen. My brain refused to work. Every cell in my body screamed for sleep. But I kept going. The project was too important to relax. The last few weeks had turned into a vicious cycle. Work. Sleepless nights. More work. I was practically living in this office. Sipping cold coffee and hoping my nerves wouldn't snap. When the clock finally crept toward midnight, I closed my laptop and headed outside. The evening air in Chicago was cool. But it did nothing to clear the fog of exhaustion in my head. I walked to my car, dreaming only of getting home, shutting my bedroom door, and finally disconnecting from this endless cycle. I arrived home when everyone was already asleep. The living room lights were off. And the only source of light was the lamp in the kitchen, where I saw a familiar silhouette. Susan. My father's stepmother. Methodically chopping vegetables for tomorrow's breakfast. She was younger than my father. Stylish. Always composed. With a light smile on her face. We rarely talked. More because of my busy schedule than anything personal. Hi Alex. How's work? Her voice was soft. But I could hear hidden concern in it. Same as always. Tomorrow is critical. The presentation. I said as I walked by. Already ready to head upstairs. Did you have dinner? Her gaze was attentive. But I didn't stop. I'll eat tomorrow. Too tired. I replied. Heading toward the stairs. Sleep was the only goal at that moment. I entered my room without turning on the light. The white noise of exhaustion rang in my head. As soon as I lay down, my thoughts began to blur. And soon I slipped into sleep as if someone had switched off the light. I don't remember how deeply I slept. But I woke up with the feeling that something had changed. I was almost certain I heard the door creak. Opening my eyes, I saw a faint light streaming through the slightly open door. And there, standing in the doorway, was Susan. Why was she here? I quickly looked around. But nothing unusual was happening. Just silence and her figure against the light. My head was too foggy from sleep to think about it. I blinked, ready to ask what was wrong. But didn't get the chance. She stepped closer. Her quiet steps sounding like breaking glass beneath her feet. I felt that something strange was happening. But I couldn't figure out what exactly. Susan stopped by the bed. Her hands trembling slightly. And in that moment a strange unease gripped me. The unsettling feeling wouldn't leave me as Susan quietly moved closer. Her face was almost indistinguishable in the dim light. But something in her eyes. There was something strange. As if they were hiding more than just concern. I sat up in bed, trying to shake off the sleepiness. But the tension only grew. Is everything okay? I asked, feeling my heart start to beat faster. The question was simple. But it felt important in that moment. You looked so tired. She responded softly. As if she needed to justify her presence. I just wanted to make sure you were all right. The words sounded unnatural. Too soft. Too caring. I had never felt such closeness from Susan before. She always kept her distance. Which made her presence now especially tense. The silence hung in the air as if the atmosphere had thickened. Thanks. I'm fine. I mumbled. Hoping she would leave. But she didn't move. Instead, Susan sat down on the edge of the bed. Her hand slowly touching my shoulder. A light. Almost imperceptible. Gesture. But it immediately triggered a wave of unease. Something was wrong. Too close. Too personal. Alex. You work so hard. But I see that you need a break. Just rest a little. Her voice was low, hypnotic. She looked at me in a way she never had before. My head was spinning from exhaustion, and it felt like I had stumbled into a surreal scene. I tried to get up to break the strange intimacy, but Susan suddenly took my face in her hands and leaned in. I froze. It all happened too fast to comprehend. Her lips gently touched mine, as if she was doing it with some unclear intention. Panic filled my head. But my body, unfortunately, couldn't react in time. For a moment, everything around me seemed to disappear. And this sensation, her kiss, knocked me out of reality. I pulled back, staring into her eyes with genuine confusion. My reaction surprised even me. But all I could say was, "Susan, this is wrong." She lowered her hands and turned away. But I could see her fingers trembling. A silence followed that felt like an eternity. I tried to find words to explain that we couldn't do this, but the words got stuck in my throat. It seemed like that kiss had turned something in our relationship upside down. As if we had crossed a line we hadn't even thought about before. "Sorry," she whispered, getting up from the bed as if she wanted to disappear. "That was a mistake. Please forget it." But forgetting was impossible. The morning was strangely quiet. I woke up earlier than usual, though the exhaustion was pulling me back to bed. The heaviness from the previous night weighed on me, refusing to let go. Everything seemed even more confusing than when Susan had left my room, leaving behind a suffocating atmosphere of unspoken words. I got out of bed, feeling each step echo in my head. Perhaps from the lack of sleep or from the overload of thoughts. The sun was just beginning to light up Chicago through the tall windows of the house, adding warmth and brightness to the rooms. But inside me, there was only anxiety. My thoughts kept returning to the kiss. What did it mean? Why did she do that? When I went downstairs, I saw Susan in the kitchen. She stood with her back to me, preparing breakfast. Her movements were mechanical, as if she was lost in her own thoughts, making her seem even more distant than usual. I tried to act calmly, though I felt uncomfortable just being near her. "Good morning," I said quietly, hoping that her reply wouldn't remind me of what had happened. "Good morning," she responded without turning around, hoping her voice was tense. And I immediately understood that she remembered everything as clearly as I did. We were silent. Every little sound, the clinking of spoons, the quiet sizzle of butter on the pan, only intensified the feeling of this silent tension. I felt how the air between us had changed. It wasn't like before. Not like it should be between people connected through family. It was something more. And that made me uneasy. My father was still at work, and his absence seemed to magnify the weight of the situation. I sat at the table, idly spinning a fork in my hand, trying not to look at Susan. The question kept swirling in my mind. How would we continue living under the same roof after this? "Alex," she suddenly said, stopping her movement. I flinched at the unexpected sound, and my gaze automatically shifted to her. She still wasn't looking at me. What happened? It shouldn't have. Her words were sharp, as if she was trying to push the entire situation away in one swift motion. I didn't know what to say. Of course it was wrong. Of course it shouldn't have happened. But her kiss had already left a mark, one that couldn't be erased. "Susan," I began, feeling like I had to say something in response. But the words didn't come. How could I sum up all this complexity in one sentence? It seemed impossible. She finally turned to me, her eyes looking tired but determined. "We'll just forget it," she said firmly, as if trying to convince herself. But inside, I knew that forgetting it was impossible. Just as it was impossible to return our relationship to the way it had been. Time seemed to slow down after our conversation in the kitchen. Everything in the house became strangely quiet. And every little detail reminded me of the awkwardness between Susan and me. We continued pretending that everything was fine. That we could just ignore what had happened. But of course that was impossible. Every morning, when I saw her at breakfast, she looked a little more tense than usual. I tried to avoid extra glances and conversations, hoping that if I just kept my distance, everything would sort itself out. But one thing I knew for sure. Forgetting that kiss wasn't going to happen. It had already become something that had changed the dynamic of our lives. It was like a frozen silence that hung in every move. Every word. One evening, when my father stayed late at work, I decided to come home earlier than usual. The day had been incredibly exhausting. And I just wanted to relax in front of the TV, trying not to think about work or what was happening at home. I thought Susan would be in her room, and I'd have a quiet evening alone. But when I walked into the living room, she was sitting on the couch, staring into space as if lost in deep thought. When she noticed me, she said. Susan gave a quiet nod, as if inviting me to sit down next to her. I hesitated. But something in her gaze told me that this conversation was inevitable. I thought we could forget, she said after a short pause, breaking the tense silence. Her voice was quiet, but there was exhaustion in it. But it seems we've both been too silent about what shouldn't have happened. I sighed, feeling the tension rise. Forgetting isn't as easy as it seemed. Susan fell silent again, her hands trembling as if she was struggling to maintain her composure. She suddenly turned to me and looked me in the eyes. For the first time in a long while. That look wasn't just a look. It was a world of emotions. Regret. Pain. And something else I couldn't quite define. I didn't mean to. She began. But stopped again. Trying to find the right words. It was all a mistake. We sat in silence, as if unsure of what to say next. The air was filled with a strange mix of awkwardness and tension that couldn't be ignored. It felt like this scene was happening in another dimension, far from the rest of the world. I stood up, intending to end this conversation that had been hanging over us for too long. But her voice stopped me at the door. Alex. She said it, as if she wanted to say something else important, but then fell silent. I turned, expecting her to continue. But it seemed like Susan herself didn't know what exactly to say. After that evening, everything began to fall apart. On the surface, Susan and I continued to live as before. She managed the household. I worked on my projects. And my father seemed oblivious to anything strange. But inwardly, everything was different. An invisible wall between us grew higher with each passing day. One evening, when my father stayed late at work again, I returned home slightly later than usual. It had already begun to grow dark outside, and I found myself reluctant to go inside. The house felt foreign to me, as if it was no longer the place where I could find peace. Inside me, conflicting emotions battled. Guilt. And at the same time, a strange relief that we had finally talked about it. Though not completely. When I entered, the light in the living room was dim. And I immediately noticed that Susan was waiting for me. She sat in the chair, arms crossed on her lap, her face serious and tense. We remained silent for a long time before I slowly sat across from her. Alex. We need to talk. She began, not breaking eye contact. I can't keep going like this. We're pretending that nothing happened. But it's eating me up inside. I nodded in agreement. although I wasn't sure the conversation would change anything. We can't keep living like it was just a random mistake. Susan continued. Her voice quiet, but determined. It's too hard for both of us. And it's not just about what happened then. Everything we haven't been saying to each other seems to be destroying us from the inside. I felt her words reach deep inside me, as if they were opening up feelings I had been trying to suppress. It was like tearing open an old wound that had never really healed. You're right, I admitted, looking away. We can't forget it, no matter how hard we try. Susan looked at me. Her eyes filled with sadness and something else. Maybe understanding. She moved closer, her movements careful but assured. In that moment, there was no awkwardness between us. Only the realization of how vulnerable we both were. We just have to let it go, she said softly, lowering her head. This conversation wasn't about forgiveness. It was about stopping the pretense that we could go back to the way things were. And in that moment, I realized that we could finally move forward, leaving everything behind, but understanding that we would never be the same. When my father came home, everything was already calm. Susan and I sat at the table like two people who, after going through something too complex, had learned to silently understand each other. There was still a faint trace of unsaid words in the air, but it no longer destroyed us. Susan smiled at my father. And for the first time in a long time, I felt that the world around us was starting to heal.